In the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, a 72-year-old retired nurse was about to discover that the family she'd financially supported for decades saw her as nothing more than an ATM with a pulse. What started as a routine medical appointment became the catalyst for the most expensive lesson in gratitude her ungrateful children would ever receive. When Dorothy Hansen overheard her son and daughter-in-law planning to cancel her cancer screening to save money on gas, she made a decision that would cost them everything they thought they were entitled to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Dorothy Hansen's modest colonial home on Maple Street, casting gentle shadows across the mahogany dining table, where 3 generations of family photos chronicled what had once been genuine happiness. At 72, Dorothy moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 43 years as a registered nurse, measuring medications with precision, organizing her pill dispenser with methodical care, and reviewing her appointment calendar with the attention to detail that had once saved lives in Richmond General Hospital's cardiac unit. Her hands, weathered but steady despite the arthritis that whispered warnings with each movement, paused over the calendar entry circled in red ink. Dr. Morrison, Oncology Follow-up, 2:30 p.m. 6 months had passed since her last screening. 6 months since the radiologist had found what he cautiously termed areas of concern that required ongoing monitoring. The words had lodged themselves in her chest like splinters, not from fear of mortality. 43 years in nursing had taught her that death was simply another patient to be managed with dignity, but from the exhausting weight of facing medical uncertainty while pretending strength for a family that had forgotten she was human. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent decades caring for other people's mothers, fathers, and children, while her own adult children seemed to view her primarily as a source of financial convenience. Dorothy's modest pension from the hospital, combined with her late husband Robert's Social Security and the small savings account they'd built through decades of careful budgeting, had become the invisible foundation supporting her son Michael's struggling landscaping business and her daughter Jennifer's expensive lifestyle in short pump. Michael, now 48, had inherited his father's height and broad shoulders, but none of Robert's quiet integrity or work ethic. What had started as a promising lawn care service 15 years ago had devolved into a series of failed expansion attempts, expensive equipment purchases that gathered rust in his garage, and a pattern of promising client services he couldn't deliver. Each crisis brought him to Dorothy's doorstep with explanations that grew more elaborate and desperate with each iteration. The transmission in his truck needed replacement. A client had refused to pay for completed work. Equipment had been stolen from a job site. The stories varied, but the solution was always the same. Mom would understand. Mom would help. Mom always came through. Jennifer, 2 years younger than Michael, had perfected a different approach to family exploitation. Where Michael's requests came wrapped in manufactured emergencies, Jennifer's demands arrived disguised as opportunities for Dorothy to participate in her daughter's social advancement. The country club membership that Jennifer simply couldn't afford to lose because of, quote, important networking opportunities. The private school tuition for Jennifer's twin daughters because public schools in Henrico County just aren't adequate for children with their potential. The European vacation that was really more of an educational experience that would broaden the twins' cultural awareness. Each request was presented with the implicit understanding that Dorothy's role was to facilitate Jennifer's vision of herself as a successful suburban mother, whose husband's middle management salary at the insurance company was merely supplemented by her mother's generosity, never dependent upon it. The fiction required careful maintenance. Jennifer's friends could never know that the elegant dinner parties and designer handbags were funded by a retired nurse's pension checks. Dorothy's basement office, a cramped space she'd converted from Robert's workshop after his sudden heart attack 3 years ago, contained the evidence of her children's financial dependence meticulously organized in manila folders. Michael's folder bulged with loan documentation, payment schedules he'd never honored, and increasingly frantic text messages about business opportunities that required just a little startup capital to guarantee success. Jennifer's folder read like a catalog of upper-middle-class aspirations: receipts for tennis lessons, invoices for landscape design consultations, and payment confirmations for social events that cost more than Dorothy spent on groceries in 6 months. The numbers told a story her children preferred to ignore. Over the past 3 years, Dorothy had provided Michael with $47,000 in loans that existed only in her careful records. Money he'd borrowed but never formally acknowledged, assistance he'd accepted but never repaid. Jennifer's folder contained $31,000 in gifts that had funded everything from family vacations to home renovations, contributions that Jennifer mentioned only when requesting additional support for related expenses. What her children didn't know, what they'd never bothered to investigate despite their casual assumptions about her financial capacity, was that Dorothy's generosity had been systematically draining her own security. The modest nest egg she and Robert had built through 43 years of careful saving was disappearing at an alarming rate. Her own medical expenses, the rising costs of prescription medications, and the routine maintenance on a house that was aging as gracefully as she was, had all been deferred or minimized to accommodate her children's endless needs. The irony cut deeper because Dorothy's financial sacrifice had enabled her children's most toxic assumptions about money and family obligation. Michael genuinely believed that his landscaping business was almost profitable, and that his mother's loans were temporary assistance rather than permanent subsidy. Jennifer had convinced herself that her lifestyle was sustainable and that Dorothy's contributions were expressions of grandmotherly love, rather than enabling behavior that prevented her daughter from living within her means. Dorothy's kitchen phone rang with the aggressive persistence that characterized all of Michael's communications. She answered on the 4th ring, already bracing for whatever crisis would require immediate resolution. "Mom, thank God you're home." Michael's voice carried the breathless urgency he'd perfected for maximum emotional impact. "Listen, I've got a situation with the Henderson job, and I need to borrow the truck for a couple of days. Mine's making that noise again, and I can't afford to have it break down in front of clients." Dorothy glanced at her appointment calendar, the red circle around Dr. Morrison's name seeming to pulse with importance. "Michael, I have a doctor's appointment this afternoon. I'll need the truck to get to the medical center." The pause that followed lasted long enough for Dorothy to hear her son's mental calculations: the cost of gas, the inconvenience of rescheduling, the effort required to solve his transportation problem without involving her resources. "Can't you reschedule the appointment?" Michael asked with the casual tone of someone requesting a minor favor. "I mean, it's not like it's an emergency, right?" "Just a routine checkup?" "The Henderson job is worth $3,000, Mom. That's real money that could help me catch up on some bills." The dismissal of her medical needs as optional while his business problems demanded immediate priority was breathtaking in its selfishness. Dorothy felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with her cardiac history and everything to do with the accumulated weight of being valued only for her utility. "It's not a routine checkup, Michael. It's a follow-up appointment with my oncologist. You know the cancer screening we discussed 6 months ago?" Another pause, this one heavy with the calculations that Michael was making between his mother's health concerns and his immediate financial needs. "Right, of course. But couldn't you take the bus? Or maybe ask Jennifer to drive you. I'm sure she wouldn't mind helping out." The suggestion that Dorothy should inconvenience Jennifer rather than interrupt his work schedule revealed exactly how Michael prioritized family obligations. Dorothy closed her eyes, feeling the familiar pattern of accommodation beginning to assert itself. 43 years of nursing had trained her to put other people's needs first, to find solutions that minimized conflict and maximized care for everyone except herself. The old Dorothy would have found an alternative, would have called Jennifer despite knowing her daughter's busy social calendar, would have rescheduled her appointment to accommodate Michael's crisis. But sitting in her kitchen with the morning sun illuminating the photo of Robert on the refrigerator, Robert, who had worked 2 jobs to put Michael through college, who had walked Jennifer down the aisle at a wedding that cost more than his annual salary, Dorothy felt something shift. A small crack in the foundation of endless accommodation, a hairline fracture that would soon become a chasm. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice carrying a note that Michael was too self-absorbed to recognize as warning. "Thanks, Mom. You're the best. I'll swing by around noon to pick up the keys." The line went dead before Dorothy could respond, leaving her staring at the phone in her hand and wondering when her children had stopped asking for favors and started issuing instructions. The red circle on her calendar seemed to grow larger, more insistent, a reminder that some appointments couldn't be rescheduled, some needs couldn't be deferred, and some family obligations flowed in directions her children had forgotten to consider. Outside her kitchen window, the maple tree Robert had planted the year Michael was born swayed in the autumn breeze, its leaves turning the brilliant orange that had always reminded her why they'd chosen this house, this life, this family. Soon those leaves would fall, and the tree would stand bare against the winter sky, its beauty dependent not on what it displayed, but on the strength of roots that remained invisible beneath the surface. Dorothy was about to discover that her own roots ran deeper than anyone realized, and that the woman her children saw as endlessly giving was capable of choices that would shake their comfortable assumptions to the ground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dorothy's morning routine was interrupted at 10:47 a.m. by the familiar sound of Jennifer's BMW pulling into the driveway, with the sharp efficiency that characterized all of her daughter's movements. Through the kitchen window, Dorothy watched Jennifer emerge from the driver's seat, wearing the kind of athletic wear that cost more than Dorothy spent on groceries in a month. Designer leggings and a matching top that suggested a lifestyle of personal trainers and boutique fitness classes that someone else was funding. The front door opened without a knock, a privilege Jennifer had claimed years ago under the guise of family closeness, but which Dorothy increasingly recognized as a symptom of boundary issues that extended far beyond simple manners. Jennifer's voice carried through the house with the projected confidence of someone who'd learned that volume could substitute for authority. "Mom, are you home? I need to talk to you about something important." Dorothy remained in the kitchen, not rushing to accommodate Jennifer's sense of urgency. Through the archway that connected the kitchen to the living room, she could see Jennifer surveying the modest furnishings with the critical eye she'd developed since marrying Kevin, and moving to the expensive suburb of Short Pump. Everything in Dorothy's house, the furniture she and Robert had chosen together, the decorations accumulated over 40 years of marriage, the family photos that chronicled genuinely happy moments, had become subject to Jennifer's running commentary about updating and modernizing that never quite concealed her embarrassment about her mother's middle-class aesthetic. "I'm in the kitchen," Dorothy called, continuing to organize her medication dispenser with deliberate calm. Jennifer appeared in the doorway carrying an oversized handbag that probably cost more than Dorothy's monthly pension check, and wearing the expression of someone delivering news that she'd already decided was reasonable regardless of how it might be received. "Perfect timing," Jennifer announced, settling into one of the kitchen chairs with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been told she wasn't welcome anywhere. "Michael's on his way over, and we need to discuss some family logistics." The phrase, family logistics, was Jennifer's euphemism for conversations where Dorothy's resources were reallocated to solve other people's problems. Dorothy had learned to recognize the terminology that preceded requests for money, transportation, or other forms of assistance that were presented as collaborative family decisions rather than one-sided demands. "What kind of logistics?" Dorothy asked, though she suspected she already knew the direction this conversation would take. "Well, it's about being more efficient with expenses," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation. "Kevin and I have been reviewing the family budget, and we've identified some areas where we could all save money by being more strategic about priorities." The presumption that Jennifer and Kevin had any authority to review family budgets or establish priorities for Dorothy's life was breathtaking. But Dorothy had learned that challenging Jennifer's assumptions directly only triggered elaborate justifications that made the original request seem more reasonable by comparison. Michael's truck rumbled into the driveway with the grinding persistence of an engine that needed attention he couldn't afford to provide. Dorothy heard his heavy footsteps on the front porch, followed by the sound of Jennifer calling out before he'd fully entered the house. "Perfect timing! We were just getting started." Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway looking like a man who'd been running late for most of his adult life. His work clothes bore the honest stains of someone who actually performed manual labor, but his expression carried the hunted look of someone who'd run out of solutions to problems that kept multiplying faster than his ability to solve them. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek with the automatic affection that had become routine rather than genuine. "Jen told me you wanted to talk about some money-saving ideas." Dorothy noted the casual revision of history. Jennifer's budget review had become Dorothy's initiative to save money. The subtle repositioning of responsibility was typical of her children's approach to family conversations. They rarely presented their requests as demands. Instead, they reframed situations to make their needs appear to align with Dorothy's supposed interests. "Actually," Dorothy said carefully, "Jennifer mentioned that you two had identified areas where the family could save money. I'm curious to hear your thoughts." Jennifer and Michael exchanged a look that Dorothy recognized as coordination between siblings who discussed this conversation before arriving. The realization that her children had planned this intervention without including her in the planning process was both hurtful and illuminating. "Well," Jennifer began, settling into her explanation with the confidence of someone who'd prepared for objections, "we've been thinking about transportation costs. Gas prices are really affecting everyone's budget, and some of the driving we do could probably be consolidated or eliminated." Michael nodded with the enthusiasm of someone supporting a teammate. "Exactly. Like today, for instance. I've got this huge job opportunity with the Hendersons, potentially $3,000 in revenue, but my truck is making that noise again. Meanwhile, you've got a doctor's appointment that's probably just routine, right?" Dorothy felt her blood pressure rise as she recognized the direction this conversation was heading. "It's not routine, Michael. It's an oncology follow-up. Cancer screening." Jennifer's expression shifted slightly, acknowledging the seriousness of cancer screening while simultaneously minimizing its urgency. "Of course, Mom, and your health is absolutely the priority. But Kevin looked up your doctor online, and Dr. Morrison has excellent reviews. I'm sure if there was anything seriously wrong, they would have called you immediately after your last appointment." The casual research into her medical care without her knowledge or consent was another violation of boundaries that Jennifer presented as thoughtful concern. Dorothy was beginning to understand that her children had been discussing her life, her health, and her resources in conversations that didn't include her input. "The point is," Michael continued, picking up Jennifer's thread with practiced coordination, "if it's really just a follow-up appointment, maybe it could be rescheduled for a day when I don't have such a critical business opportunity. $3,000 could really help me catch up on some overdue bills." "And," Jennifer added with the tone of someone offering a generous compromise, "if you did need to reschedule, Kevin and I could drive you to the rescheduled appointment. We'd be happy to help out when the timing works better for everyone." Dorothy studied her children's faces, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. They weren't cruel people, she realized. They were selfish people who'd learned to dress their selfishness in the language of family cooperation and mutual benefit. They genuinely believed that Dorothy's medical appointment was less important than Michael's business opportunity, and that rescheduling her cancer screening was a reasonable accommodation to make for his financial benefit. "Let me make sure I understand," Dorothy said slowly. "You want me to reschedule my oncology appointment so that Michael can borrow my truck for a landscaping job." "It's not just a landscaping job," Michael protested, with the defensive energy of someone whose business was routinely dismissed. "This is the Henderson estate. They're talking about a complete landscape redesign worth potentially $15,000 over the next year. This initial job is basically an audition for a long-term contract." Jennifer leaned forward with the earnest expression she used when explaining why her requests were actually opportunities for Dorothy to participate in the family's success. "Think about it, Mom. If Michael lands this contract, he could finally get his business stabilized. That would mean he wouldn't need to borrow money from you anymore. In the long run, helping him today could save you thousands of dollars." The logic was seductive in the way that all of Jennifer's manipulations were seductive. It reframed Dorothy's sacrifice as an investment in her own financial future rather than another subsidy for Michael's poor planning. But Dorothy had heard variations of this argument countless times before, and she'd learned that Michael's business opportunities never translated into financial independence, only into larger requests for funding. "And," Jennifer continued, building momentum, "if you reschedule the appointment for next week, Kevin and I could make it a whole outing. We could drive you to the medical center, maybe stop for lunch afterward. Make it a nice mother-daughter day. The offer was genuine in its way, but it also revealed how Jennifer viewed Dorothy's medical care as an opportunity for bonding rather than a necessary health intervention that shouldn't be subject to other people's scheduling preferences. Michael checked his phone with the impatience of someone who'd already decided the outcome of this conversation. I really need to know soon, Mom. The Hendersons are expecting me this afternoon, and if I have to figure out alternative transportation, I need time to make arrangements. Dorothy looked at her two adult children, both of whom were staring at her, with the expectant expressions of people who'd presented what they considered a reasonable request and were waiting for her inevitable accommodation. Neither of them seemed to recognize that they were asking her to prioritize Michael's business opportunity over her cancer screening, or that their casual dismissal of her medical needs revealed something fundamental about how they valued her well-being relative to their convenience. I need a few minutes to think about this, Dorothy said finally. Of course, Jennifer said, with the gracious tone of someone granting permission for deliberation. Take all the time you need. We just want to make sure we're all working together as a family. As Dorothy excused herself to use the bathroom, she could hear Jennifer and Michael continuing their conversation in lowered voices. The hallway bathroom was directly above the kitchen, and sound traveled through the old house's thin floors with surprising clarity. What she heard next would change everything. Do you really think she'll reschedule? Michael's voice carried through the floorboards. She always does, Jennifer replied with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about their mother's predictability. Mom's biggest weakness is that she can't stand disappointing us. She'll grumble a little bit, but she'll reschedule. Good, because I really can't afford to lose this job. I've already promised the Hendersons I'd be there today. Just make sure you actually complete the work this time, Jennifer said with sisterly bluntness. The last thing we need is another situation where you take Mom's help and then screw up the opportunity. That's not fair. The Morrison job fell through because they changed their minds about the design, not because I did anything wrong. Whatever. The point is, we need to start being more strategic about how we handle Mom's resources. She's not getting any younger, and she's starting to develop some weird ideas about budgeting. Dorothy pressed her back against the bathroom door, her heart pounding as she processed the casual discussion of her life and resources as family assets to be managed strategically. What do you mean, weird ideas? Michael asked. Last week, she mentioned something about needing to be more careful with spending because her medical expenses are getting expensive. I think she's starting to worry about money in a way that could affect her generosity. That's ridiculous. Mom's pension is solid, and she's got savings. She's just being dramatic. Maybe, but Kevin thinks we should be more proactive about ensuring she doesn't make any impulsive financial decisions. Like, if she starts worrying about money, she might decide to stop helping us with legitimate needs. The phrase legitimate needs hung in the air like an accusation. Dorothy realized that her children had categorized her support for their lifestyle choices as meeting legitimate family obligations rather than voluntary assistance that she could withdraw at any time. So what are you suggesting? Michael asked. I think we need to be more involved in her financial planning. Maybe suggest that she add one of us to her bank accounts for convenience. In case something happens to her health and she needs help managing bills. Dorothy's hands clenched into fists as she understood the scope of what Jennifer was proposing. Her daughter wasn't just planning to manage Dorothy's medical schedule for convenience. She was strategizing about gaining control over Dorothy's financial resources under the guise of helping with her aging process. That makes sense, Michael agreed, especially if her health is declining. Having cancer screenings and all that, it's probably smart to have family involved in her finances anyway. The casual reference to her health concerns as justification for financial oversight was the final revelation Dorothy needed. Her children weren't just dismissing her medical needs for their convenience. They were viewing her aging and potential health problems as opportunities to gain greater control over the resources they'd come to see as their inheritance. Standing in her own bathroom, listening to her children plan her future without her input, Dorothy felt something crystallize inside her chest. For years, she'd accommodated their requests because she believed that family meant sacrifice, that love meant putting other people's needs first, that being a good mother meant enabling her children's happiness even at the cost of her own well-being. But listening to Jennifer and Michael discuss her life as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be respected, Dorothy finally understood the difference between supporting family and enabling exploitation. Her children didn't see her medical appointment as important, because they didn't see her as important beyond her utility to their lifestyle and financial security. The conversation below continued, but Dorothy had heard enough. She flushed the toilet and ran water in the sink, buying herself a few more moments to process what she'd learned and decide how to respond. When she returned to the kitchen, Jennifer and Michael were sitting exactly where she'd left them, their expressions carefully arranged to suggest they'd been patiently waiting rather than planning her financial future. "So," Jennifer said with cheerful expectation, "have you decided about the appointment?" Dorothy looked at her children, really looked at them, and saw them clearly for the first time in years. They were adults who'd learned to view her love as a resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured. They were people who would reschedule her cancer screening without guilt and plan to control her finances without shame. And they were about to learn that the quiet nurse who'd spent 3 years accommodating their every demand was capable of decisions that would reshape their comfortable assumptions about family, money, and respect. "Yes," Dorothy said quietly. "I've decided." The silence that followed Dorothy's quiet "I've decided" stretched long enough for her children to shift uncomfortably in their kitchen chairs. Jennifer's expectant smile began to falter as she registered something different in her mother's tone, a calmness that didn't match the accommodating energy they'd come to expect from family negotiations. "Great," Michael said, checking his phone again with barely concealed impatience. "So I can take the truck this afternoon?" Dorothy walked to the kitchen counter, where her purse sat beside a neat stack of mail she'd been processing that morning. Among the usual collection of medical bills and pension statements was an envelope she hadn't yet opened. Thick, cream-colored paper with the return address of Morrison, Hayes & Associates Financial Planning Services. The letter had arrived yesterday, but the morning's drama with Michael's demands had delayed her usual routine of immediately reviewing all correspondence. "Actually," Dorothy said, turning to face her children while holding the unopened envelope, "I need to take care of some financial business this afternoon. My appointment with Dr. Morrison will have to remain as scheduled." Jennifer's expression shifted from expectation to confusion. "Financial business? Mom, what kind of financial business could be more urgent than Michael's job opportunity?" The question revealed exactly how Jennifer viewed Dorothy's life, as a series of minor administrative tasks that could be rearranged to accommodate more important people's real obligations. Dorothy had spent 3 years absorbing that casual dismissal of her priorities, but this morning's overheard conversation had fundamentally altered her tolerance for being treated as a supporting character in her own life. "The kind that determines whether I continue funding other people's lifestyle choices," Dorothy replied evenly. Michael's head snapped up from his phone. "What's that supposed to mean?" Dorothy slid her finger under the envelope's seal, extracting a multi-page document that she scanned quickly. Her expression changed as she processed the contents, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been satisfaction crossing her features. "It means," Dorothy said slowly, still reading, "that Robert was more strategic about our financial planning than I realized." The letter was from the financial planning firm that had managed her late husband's retirement accounts that Dorothy had assumed were modest based on Robert's careful lifestyle and conservative spending habits. What she was discovering, 3 years after his death, was that Robert had been far more successful at building wealth than either of them had acknowledged during their marriage. According to the detailed financial summary, Robert's careful investments and retirement planning had created a portfolio worth significantly more than Dorothy had known. The original retirement accounts had been supplemented by life insurance policies, veterans' benefits, and investment accounts that had grown substantially over the 43 years of his career. More importantly, the letter explained that Dorothy had been named as the primary beneficiary of accounts she'd never known existed, accounts that Robert had specifically structured to remain separate from their joint finances. Jennifer stood up abruptly, moving to read over Dorothy's shoulder with the entitled curiosity that characterized all her interactions with her mother's business. "What kind of financial planning? Mom, you should have told us if you were working with financial advisors. Kevin and I could have helped you understand the documents." The assumption that Dorothy needed her daughter's husband to interpret her own financial information was insulting, but it also revealed how completely Jennifer underestimated her mother's capacity for independent decision-making. Dorothy stepped away from Jennifer's intrusion, holding the letter against her chest. "This is the first I'm learning about it myself," Dorothy said. "Apparently your father set up several accounts that I wasn't supposed to access until I reached a specific age, or until I faced significant medical expenses." Michael's interest sharpened immediately. "How much money are we talking about?" The casual use of "we" was breathtaking in its presumption. Michael had just revealed that he considered any assets Dorothy possessed to be family resources that affected him directly. Dorothy realized that her children had never seen her money as belonging to her. In their minds, she was merely the current custodian of resources that would eventually become their inheritance. "We aren't talking about any amount of money," Dorothy replied sharply. "I'm learning about accounts that belong to me." Jennifer's voice took on the patient tone she used when explaining obvious truths to people who were being deliberately obtuse. "Of course they belong to you, Mom. But families share financial information so everyone can plan appropriately. If Dad left you more money than we realized, that affects decisions about Michael's business investments and the twins' college planning." The speed with which Jennifer connected Dorothy's potential assets to her own family's expenses was remarkable. Within seconds of learning that Dorothy might have access to additional funds, Jennifer was already calculating how those resources could solve her immediate financial concerns. Dorothy walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the maple tree Robert had planted and thinking about the man who'd apparently understood his family well enough to structure his financial legacy with careful protections. The letter indicated that Robert had worked with financial planners to ensure Dorothy would have resources available for her medical care and independent living. But he'd also included specific instructions about managing those resources responsibly. "According to this letter," Dorothy said, still reading, "your father was concerned about family members who might view my financial security as an opportunity for their own benefit." The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by Michael's defensive response. "That's ridiculous. We've never asked you for anything unreasonable. Everything you've helped us with has been legitimate family support." Dorothy turned from the window to study her son's face. $47,000 over 3 years is legitimate family support? Michael's expression went blank as he processed the fact that Dorothy had been keeping precise records of their financial transactions. I didn't realize you were tracking everything so specifically." "Of course I was tracking it. I'm a nurse, Michael. We document everything." Dorothy's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades maintaining accurate records under life and death circumstances. "Did you think I was just handing out money without paying attention to the amounts?" Jennifer sat back down, her strategic mind already working on damage control. "Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The help you've provided has always been appreciated, and we've always intended to pay you back when our situation's improved." "Have you?" Dorothy asked. "Because I don't have any documentation of repayment plans or schedules. What I have is a pattern of requests that are always urgent, always justified, and never followed up with actual repayment." The financial planning letter had provided Dorothy with more than information about Robert's accounts. It had given her a framework for understanding her own situation with new clarity. Robert's careful financial planning had been motivated by his understanding that Dorothy would need independence and security, especially if she faced medical challenges. His foresight had created exactly the resources she needed to stop subsidizing other people's financial irresponsibility. Michael's phone buzzed with a text message, and Dorothy could see his anxiety ratcheting up as he read it. "Mom, this conversation is important, but I really need to resolve the truck situation. The Hendersons are confirming their afternoon appointment, and I can't afford to lose this opportunity." The fact that Michael was still focused on borrowing her truck after learning that she had access to financial resources he'd never known about revealed everything Dorothy needed to understand about his priorities. He wasn't reconsidering his request in light of new information. He was simply adding her newly discovered financial capacity to his mental list of family resources available for his benefit. "You're not borrowing my truck," Dorothy said with finality. "What?" Michael's voice rose with genuine shock. "But we just spent 20 minutes discussing this." You said you were thinking about it. I said I was thinking about it before I learned that my children see my medical appointments as inconveniences and my financial resources as family assets they're entitled to access. Dorothy's voice remained calm, but her words carried the weight of someone who'd finally reached the limits of their accommodation. Jennifer stood up again, moving into what Dorothy recognized as her daughter's crisis management mode. Mom, I think you're misunderstanding our intentions. We're not trying to take advantage of you. We're trying to work together as a family to solve everyone's problems efficiently. By canceling my cancer screening to save money on gas? Dorothy asked. By rescheduling a routine appointment to help Michael secure a significant business opportunity, Jennifer corrected, her voice taking on the edge that appeared when her explanations weren't immediately accepted. Dorothy realized that Jennifer genuinely didn't understand why rescheduling a cancer screening was problematic. In Jennifer's mind, family cooperation meant that everyone's needs were negotiable except her own, and the most pressing need always belonged to whoever was experiencing the most immediate crisis. The possibility that Dorothy's medical care might be time-sensitive or that her independence might be valuable didn't factor into Jennifer's calculations. I'm keeping my medical appointment, Dorothy said. I'm not rescheduling for Michael's convenience, and I'm not lending my truck for his business opportunity. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. This is unbelievable. After everything I've done for this family, you won't help me when I really need it? The question was so divorced from reality that Dorothy almost laughed. What exactly have you done for this family, Michael? I've been taking care of your yard work for 3 years. I fixed your gutters last spring. I've been available whenever you needed help with heavy lifting or home maintenance. Dorothy considered this inventory of Michael's contributions, weighing them against the $47,000 in financial support she'd provided. Michael, I pay you for the yard work. The gutter repair cost me $600 in materials, and you borrowed $200 for tools that you never returned. The heavy lifting you're referring to was moving furniture when you helped Jennifer redecorate her living room with accessories I funded. Each item in Michael's list of contributions dissolved under scrutiny, revealing a pattern of transactions where Dorothy had paid for both his labor and the materials for any work he'd performed. What Michael had characterized as family assistance was actually paid employment supplemented by additional loans he'd never repaid. Jennifer recognized that Michael's approach was failing and shifted to a different strategy. Mom, obviously there have been some miscommunications about expectations. Why don't we all sit down this weekend with Kevin and really talk through how we can better support each other as a family? The suggestion of bringing Kevin into family financial discussions was another boundary violation that Dorothy was only now recognizing as such. Jennifer's husband had no standing to participate in conversations about Dorothy's resources, but Jennifer's casual inclusion of him revealed how extensively she'd involved outside parties in managing her mother's affairs. I don't think that will be necessary, Dorothy said. I think I need to spend some time reviewing my financial situation and making decisions about how to manage my resources going forward. The phrase, my resources, landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of realization that spread across both children's faces. For the first time in their adult lives, Dorothy was claiming ownership of her assets, rather than treating them as family resources available for redistribution. Michael checked his phone again, his frustration reaching a breaking point. Fine, I'll figure out my own transportation. But don't expect me to be available for yard work this weekend. If family cooperation doesn't work both ways, then maybe I need to reconsider my commitments too. The threat was intended to pressure Dorothy into reconsidering, but it only confirmed her growing understanding of how her children viewed their relationship. Michael's yard work wasn't generous family assistance, it was a service he provided in exchange for financial support. His threat to withdraw that service was essentially an ultimatum: continue funding his lifestyle, or lose access to paid labor he'd been characterizing as family cooperation. That's fine, Michael. I'll hire a landscaping service. The casual acceptance of his threat clearly wasn't the response Michael had expected. He stood for a moment, apparently waiting for Dorothy to reconsider, before grabbing his jacket with the aggressive energy of someone who'd lost a negotiation they'd assumed they would win. Come on, Jen. I need to figure out how to solve my transportation problem without family support. Jennifer lingered for a moment, studying Dorothy's face with the calculating expression she used when trying to determine whether a situation required immediate intervention or could be managed through patient manipulation over time. Mom, I hope you'll think carefully before making any major decisions about finances. Sometimes when people are dealing with health concerns, they can become unnecessarily worried about money in ways that affect their judgment. The suggestion that Dorothy's newfound financial awareness was a symptom of health-related anxiety rather than a reasonable response to being exploited was the perfect ending to a conversation that had revealed everything Dorothy needed to know about her children's attitudes toward her autonomy, her health, and her resources. As Jennifer followed Michael out of the house, Dorothy remained standing in her kitchen, holding Robert's financial planning letter and feeling the profound stillness that comes after a storm has passed. For 3 years, she'd been accommodating her children's demands because she'd believed that family love required endless sacrifice. This morning, she'd discovered that Robert had provided her with the resources to choose a different path, one that prioritized her own well-being and independence over other people's financial convenience. The appointment with Dr. Morrison was still circled in red on her calendar, and for the first time in months, Dorothy felt genuinely optimistic about keeping it. She had medical concerns that deserved attention, financial resources that deserved protection, and adult children who needed to learn that respect couldn't be demanded, only earned. The education was about to begin. After her children's dramatic exit, Dorothy's house felt different, not empty, but cleared of toxic energy that she hadn't realized had been suffocating her for years. She moved through the familiar rooms with new awareness, seeing her home through eyes unclouded by the constant pressure to accommodate other people's demands. The afternoon sunlight streaming through her living room windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in months, Dorothy found the sight peaceful rather than reproachful. She settled at Robert's old desk in the corner of the living room, a mahogany piece they'd bought at an estate sale during their first year of marriage, when money was tight but their dreams were expansive. The desk had served as Robert's bill-paying station for 40 years, and Dorothy had maintained his system of careful organization even after his death. Now, surrounded by the familiar scent of lemon oil and old wood, she began the methodical process of understanding exactly what her late husband had left her. The financial planning letter was more comprehensive than her initial reading had revealed. Robert had worked with Morrison, Hayes & Associates for over 15 years, beginning when he'd recognized that his pension and Social Security wouldn't provide the security Dorothy might need if she faced major medical expenses or outlived their joint savings. What Dorothy had assumed was Robert's typical conservative approach to money management had actually been sophisticated financial planning designed specifically to protect her independence. The portfolio summary revealed accounts she'd never known existed: a Roth IRA that had been growing tax-free for 20 years, a diversified investment account funded through systematic contributions from Robert's overtime pay, and a whole life insurance policy with substantial cash value that supplemented the term life insurance she'd known about. Most significant was a trust account that Robert had established specifically for Dorothy's medical care, funded with money he'd saved by working extra shifts and side jobs that she'd assumed were simply part of his generous nature. According to the detailed financial statement, the combined value of Robert's legacy was $247,000. Not enough to make Dorothy wealthy, but more than enough to provide genuine financial independence and security for her remaining years. More importantly, the financial planner's notes indicated that Robert had specifically structured these accounts to be protected from family pressure, and to require Dorothy's sole signature for any withdrawals or changes. Dorothy realized that Robert had understood something about their children's character that she'd been unwilling to acknowledge. His financial planning wasn't just about providing for her future. It was about ensuring that her resources couldn't be drained by family members who viewed her generosity as obligation rather than gift. She spent the next hour reviewing 3 years of bank statements, credit card records, and the meticulous notebooks where she'd tracked every family loan and gift. The numbers told a story that was even more disturbing than she'd realized. Michael's $47,000 in loans was just the beginning. Jennifer's $31,000 in gifts had been supplemented by thousands more in indirect support. Christmas and birthday gifts for her granddaughters that exceeded Dorothy's monthly pension, vacation contributions that Jennifer had requested to make family memories, and household expenses that Jennifer had somehow redirected to Dorothy's budget. Most revealing were the credit card statements that showed how Dorothy's own medical expenses had been repeatedly deferred to accommodate family financial emergencies. Prescription medications had been delayed, medical equipment purchases postponed, and specialist appointments rescheduled when family crises created sudden demands for funds. Dorothy had been subsidizing her children's lifestyle by compromising her own health care, exactly the scenario Robert's financial planning had been designed to prevent. At 1:15 p.m., Dorothy called Morrison Hayes and Associates to schedule an appointment with the financial planner who'd worked with Robert. The receptionist was able to fit her in for later that afternoon, after her medical appointment with Dr. Morrison, a coincidence that felt like Robert's gentle guidance from beyond. The drive to Richmond General Medical Center gave Dorothy time to process the morning's revelations. She'd spent 3 years believing that her financial support for Michael and Jennifer was temporary assistance that would end when their situations improved. Now she understood that their situations would never improve as long as they had access to someone else's resources to solve their problems. Her enabling had prevented them from developing the financial discipline and personal responsibility that might have led to genuine stability. Dr. Morrison's waiting room was familiar territory. Beige walls decorated with nature photography, magazines that promised wellness through lifestyle changes, and the particular mix of anxiety and boredom that characterized medical appointments where the stakes were higher than routine checkups. Dorothy checked in with the receptionist, noting that her insurance information was current and her copay was manageable within her actual budget, a luxury she'd almost forgotten while her children's financial crises had consumed her resources. When Dr. Morrison called her back to his office, Dorothy felt a clarity she hadn't experienced during previous visits. For months, she'd approached these appointments with the distracted worry of someone trying to balance too many competing priorities. Today, she was simply a patient focused on her own health, rather than a financial resource trying to solve everyone else's problems. "Mrs. Hansen," Dr. Morrison said, reviewing her chart with the careful attention that had made him one of Richmond's most respected oncologists, "your last screening showed some areas that we've been monitoring. Today's results will help us determine whether we need to adjust our surveillance schedule or consider additional interventions." The conversation proceeded with professional efficiency. Dorothy's mammogram and blood work revealed changes that required closer monitoring, but didn't indicate immediate crisis. Dr. Morrison recommended quarterly screenings instead of semi-annual appointments, and suggested some dietary modifications that might support her overall health. Most importantly, he prescribed a new medication that would significantly reduce her cancer risk, but required monthly blood tests to monitor for side effects. "The medication is expensive," Dr. Morrison acknowledged, "but your insurance should cover most of the cost. The important thing is consistent monitoring and adherence to the treatment schedule. Cancer prevention is always more effective and less costly than cancer treatment." Dorothy found herself nodding with genuine engagement, rather than the distracted compliance that had characterized her previous medical appointments. For the first time in months, she could focus entirely on her own health, without mentally calculating how medical expenses might affect her ability to respond to family financial emergencies. "Doctor," Dorothy said as their appointment concluded, "if someone in my situation were to experience significant stress, family stress that affected sleep and appetite, would that impact my cancer risk?" Dr. Morrison's expression shifted to the compassionate attention he reserved for patients whose medical conditions intersected with complicated life circumstances. Chronic stress absolutely affects immune function and overall health. Patients who can reduce chronic stress often see improvements in their overall well-being that support their body's natural ability to prevent and fight disease. The validation was profound. Dorothy's children had been dismissing her health concerns as routine and optional, but Dr. Morrison was confirming that the stress they created through their constant financial demands was actively undermining her medical treatment and cancer prevention efforts. After her appointment, Dorothy drove directly to Morrison Hayes and Associates, a modest office building that housed the kind of conservative financial planning practice that appealed to people like Robert, who valued steady growth over dramatic returns. James Morrison, no relation to her oncologist, was a soft-spoken man in his early 60s, who'd apparently worked with Robert for over a decade. "Mrs. Hansen," he said, rising to greet her with the formal courtesy that characterized his generation of financial professionals. "I was so sorry to hear about Robert's passing. He spoke of you often and was very concerned about ensuring your financial security." James led her through Robert's financial planning with the methodical precision of someone who understood that money represented more than numbers. It represented choices, independence, and peace of mind. Robert's portfolio had been structured not just to provide Dorothy with resources, but to protect those resources from well-meaning family members who might not understand the difference between helping and enabling. "Your husband was very specific about his concerns," James explained diplomatically. "He wanted to ensure that you would have the financial independence to make your own decisions about medical care, living arrangements, and family assistance, without pressure from people who might benefit from those decisions." The phrase, "people who might benefit from those decisions," was James's tactful way of acknowledging that Robert had anticipated exactly the family dynamics that Dorothy was now experiencing. Her husband had understood that their children's financial struggles might create pressure for Dorothy to exhaust her resources supporting their lifestyle choices rather than maintaining her own security. "What are my options?" Dorothy asked. James spread out several documents that outlined different approaches to managing Robert's legacy. Dorothy could maintain the current investment strategy, which provided steady growth with minimal risk. She could restructure the accounts to provide higher monthly income if she needed additional cash flow. Most importantly, she could establish new accounts that would be completely separate from any existing financial relationships, creating a clear boundary between her resources and her family's access to those resources. "I'd recommend opening new accounts at a different bank," James suggested carefully. "That would ensure that your financial privacy is protected, and that family members couldn't inadvertently gain access to information about your resources." The suggestion revealed that James understood the scope of Dorothy's family situation without requiring her to explain the details. Robert had apparently been thorough in describing the family dynamics that might affect Dorothy's financial security after his death. Dorothy spent an hour reviewing options, asking questions, and beginning to understand that financial independence wasn't just about having money. It was about having control over how that money was used. For 3 years, she'd treated her pension and savings as family resources available for redistribution. Robert's legacy gave her the opportunity to reclaim ownership of her financial decisions. "I'd like to proceed with establishing completely separate accounts," Dorothy said finally. "And I'd like to understand my options for discontinuing financial support that I've been providing to family members." James's expression didn't change, but Dorothy detected a slight nod of approval. "That's certainly your right. Family financial assistance should always be voluntary and sustainable. If providing support is compromising your own security or well-being, then discontinuing that support is not only reasonable, it's necessary." The validation was exactly what Dorothy needed to hear. James helped her understand that saying no to family financial requests wasn't selfishness. It was responsible financial management that protected her independence and ensured she wouldn't become a burden to anyone else in the future. By 4:30 p.m., Dorothy had established new banking relationships, transferred Robert's accounts to her sole control, and created a financial structure that would support her medical care and independent living without requiring family assistance or approval. More importantly, she'd gained clarity about the difference between generous family support and financial enabling that prevented adult children from developing their own stability. As she drove home through the familiar streets of her Richmond suburb, Dorothy felt the profound relief that comes from aligning resources with values. For 3 years, she'd been using her limited financial resources to support her children's unlimited financial demands. Now she understood that Robert's careful planning had given her the tools to choose a different path, one that prioritized her own well-being while teaching her children the valuable lesson that respect couldn't be purchased and family love couldn't be taken for granted. The evening ahead would be spent reviewing her credit card accounts, her bank statements, and her family relationships with new eyes. Tomorrow, her children would discover that the accommodating mother who'd funded their lifestyle choices for 3 years had been replaced by an independent woman who understood the difference between supporting family and enabling exploitation. The real education was about to begin, and Dorothy finally had both the resources and the resolve to ensure that the lessons would be unforgettable. Dorothy woke Thursday morning with the crystalline clarity that follows a decision long overdue. The previous evening had been spent in Robert's home office, surrounded by bank statements, credit card records, and the mounting evidence of 3 years of financial manipulation that she'd been too accommodating to recognize. Now armed with both emotional resolve and Robert's substantial financial legacy, she was ready to implement changes that would reshape her family's comfortable assumptions about money, respect, and consequences. Her first call was to Virginia Community Bank, where she'd maintained accounts for over 20 years. The conversation with customer service was brief and decisive. She wanted to cancel all authorized users on her credit cards, effective immediately. Michael had been added to her MasterCard 2 years ago during one of his business emergencies, and Jennifer had access to her Visa for what she described as family convenience purchases. Both cards would be deactivated and reissued with new numbers that only Dorothy would control. "Ma'am," the bank representative explained, "canceling authorized users will mean that anyone currently using those card numbers will have their transactions declined until you choose to add them back to the accounts." "I understand," Dorothy replied with satisfaction. "That's exactly what I want to happen." The second call was to her cell phone provider, where she discovered that her family plan had expanded far beyond the basic service she'd agreed to pay for. Michael's line included an expensive unlimited data package and international calling features. Jennifer's phone had been upgraded to the latest model with insurance coverage that cost more per month than Dorothy spent on groceries. Most surprising was the discovery of a fourth line that had been added to her account, Kevin's work phone, which Jennifer had somehow convinced customer service to include under Dorothy's family plan for convenience. "I want to remove all lines except my own," Dorothy told the customer service representative. "The other users can establish their own service. That will mean the other lines will be disconnected within 24 hours unless those users contact us to establish new accounts," the representative warned. "Perfect," Dorothy said. "They're all adults who can manage their own telecommunications needs." The third call required more delicate handling. Dorothy contacted her insurance agent to review all policies where she'd been providing coverage for family members. Jennifer's twins were listed on Dorothy's auto insurance policy because Jennifer had claimed that combining policies would save money for everyone. Michael's business liability was partially covered under an umbrella policy that Dorothy had been convinced to expand because, quote, "family businesses deserve family support." The review revealed that Dorothy had been paying premium increases for coverage that protected other people's assets while providing no benefit to her own financial security. "Mrs. Hansen," her insurance agent said carefully, "removing family members from your policies might leave them without coverage if they haven't arranged alternatives." "Their insurance coverage is their responsibility," Dorothy replied. "I'm only interested in protecting my own assets going forward." By 10:30 a.m., Dorothy had systematically removed her children's access to every financial resource they'd been casually exploiting for years. Credit cards, phone service, insurance coverage, all the invisible subsidies that had been supporting their lifestyle choices were now terminated. The process had been surprisingly simple, requiring nothing more than Dorothy's assertion of her right to control her own accounts. The first indication that her actions were being discovered came at 11:47 a.m., when Michael's truck roared into her driveway with the aggressive urgency that characterized all his crisis responses. Dorothy watched through her kitchen window as he emerged from the vehicle holding his cell phone and wearing the expression of someone whose day had taken an unexpected and unwelcome turn. "Mom!" Michael's voice carried through the house before he'd fully entered. "Something's wrong with my phone. It says the account has been suspended, and when I called customer service, they said I need to contact the primary account holder." Dorothy continued organizing her medication dispenser with deliberate calm. "That's because you're no longer on my family plan. You'll need to establish your own cellular service." Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway looking genuinely confused rather than angry. "What do you mean I'm no longer on your plan? We've had the family plan for 2 years. We had a family plan when you were contributing to family expenses and treating me with family respect," Dorothy replied evenly. "Since that's no longer the case, you can pay for your own phone service." The logic was apparently too straightforward for Michael to process immediately. He stood in her doorway, opening and closing his mouth like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "But how am I supposed to run my business without a phone?" he finally asked. "The same way millions of other business owners manage their telecommunications expenses," Dorothy suggested, "by paying for them yourself." Michael's confusion was shifting toward the anger that Dorothy had been anticipating since her conversation with the bank that morning. "This is ridiculous. You're talking about maybe $60 a month. Why are you being so petty about small expenses?" The characterization of his phone service as a, quote, small expense revealed exactly how Michael viewed financial obligations that someone else was covering. $60 per month was indeed a modest amount, modest enough that he should have been able to cover it himself, rather than assuming his mother would subsidize his business communications indefinitely. "If it's such a small expense," Dorothy observed, "then you shouldn't have any difficulty paying it yourself." Michael's phone buzzed with what Dorothy assumed was a text message, but when he looked at the screen, his expression shifted from anger to panic. "My credit card just got declined at the gas station. What's going on?" Dorothy felt a moment of genuine satisfaction at the timing. Michael's financial crisis was unfolding in real time as he discovered the scope of his dependency on resources he'd never acknowledged as Dorothy's generosity, rather than family obligation. "You're no longer an authorized user on my credit cards," Dorothy explained. "You'll need to use your own financial resources for your expenses." "My own financial resources?" Michael's voice rose to a pitch that suggested genuine desperation. "Mom, you know my business is seasonal. I don't have credit card availability right now because of some temporary cash flow issues." The phrase temporary cash flow issues was Michael's euphemism for the chronic financial mismanagement that had characterized his business operations since their inception. Dorothy had been enabling his poor planning by providing emergency funding whenever his lack of financial discipline created predictable crises. "Then perhaps this is an opportunity for you to address those cash flow issues through better business planning rather than emergency family loans," Dorothy suggested. Michael stared at her as if she'd begun speaking a foreign language. For 2 years, family emergencies had been resolved through Dorothy's immediate financial intervention. The concept that he might need to solve his own problems using his own resources was apparently revolutionary. "I can't believe you're doing this," Michael said, his voice carrying genuine hurt rather than just anger. "Yesterday you were my mother. Today you're acting like a stranger who doesn't care whether my business survives." The emotional manipulation was expertly delivered, designed to make Dorothy feel guilty for withdrawing support, rather than proud for establishing healthy boundaries. For 3 years, Michael had been training her to prioritize his feelings over her own financial security, and his wounded confusion suggested that the training had been more successful than Dorothy had realized. "Yesterday I was an ATM with unlimited funds and infinite patience," Dorothy replied. "Today I'm your mother, who loves you enough to stop enabling behavior that's preventing you from developing genuine independence." Michael's phone chose that moment to shut down completely as the cellular service termination took effect. The timing was perfect, eliminating his ability to call for backup support from Jennifer, or to coordinate a family response to Dorothy's unexpected independence. "This is insane," Michael said, staring at his dead phone. "How am I supposed to contact clients? How am I supposed to coordinate jobs? How am I supposed to run a business without basic communications?" Dorothy walked to her kitchen junk drawer and retrieved an old flip phone that she'd kept as a backup when she'd upgraded to her smartphone. "You can use this until you establish your own service. It makes calls and sends text messages, which should handle your basic business communications." Michael looked at the ancient flip phone, as if Dorothy had offered him a stone tablet and chisel. "This thing is from 2010. I can't run a modern business with a flip phone." Robert ran a successful 43-year career, with technology far less sophisticated than that flip phone, Dorothy observed. "Your business problems aren't caused by inadequate telecommunications technology." The comparison to Robert was a direct hit that Michael couldn't deflect with complaints about unfair treatment or technological limitations. Robert had built genuine financial stability through consistent work, careful planning, and personal responsibility, qualities that Michael had been able to avoid developing as long as Dorothy's resources were available to solve his problems. Michael's deflation was visible as he realized that arguing about phone technology wouldn't restore his access to Dorothy's credit cards, his position on her family plan, or his assumption that family emergencies would be automatically resolved through maternal financial intervention. "What about Jennifer?" Michael asked, apparently hoping that his sister's superior manipulation skills might succeed where his direct approach had failed. "Does she know about these changes?" Dorothy checked the kitchen clock, noting that it was nearly noon. "Jennifer will discover the changes when she attempts to use services that she's no longer authorized to access." As if summoned by their conversation, Dorothy's landline phone rang with the aggressive persistence that characterized Jennifer's communications when she encountered obstacles to her plans. Dorothy answered on the fourth ring, already prepared for the conversation that was about to unfold. "Mom?" Jennifer's voice carried the strained patience of someone attempting to resolve what she assumed was a technical error. "There seems to be some kind of problem with my credit card. The number isn't working, and when I called the bank, they said something about authorized user changes." Dorothy gestured for Michael to take a seat, anticipating that the conversation with Jennifer would require his full attention as an educational experience about consequences and family relationships. "There's no problem with your credit card," Dorothy replied calmly. "You no longer have access to my credit cards because you're no longer an authorized user." The silence that followed was long enough for Dorothy to hear Jennifer processing this information and calculating its implications for her immediate plans and long-term financial assumptions. "What do you mean I'm no longer an authorized user?" Jennifer's voice carried the dangerous edge that appeared when her explanations weren't immediately accepted as reasonable. "I mean that you can no longer make purchases using my financial resources," Dorothy clarified. "You'll need to use your own credit cards for your own expenses." Jennifer's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "My own credit cards? Mom, you know Kevin and I have been carefully managing our credit utilization to maintain our credit scores. We've been using your cards for larger purchases specifically to avoid affecting our credit profile." The explanation revealed that Jennifer had been using Dorothy's credit to protect her own financial standing, a level of manipulation that was breathtaking in its calculated selfishness. Dorothy had been unknowingly subsidizing Jennifer's credit score maintenance while absorbing the financial impact of her daughter's spending decisions. "How thoughtful of you to protect your credit profile using my financial resources," Dorothy observed. "Now you can protect your credit profile using your own financial resources." Michael gestured frantically from his chair, apparently trying to communicate something to Jennifer through Dorothy's responses. But his disconnected phone had eliminated his ability to coordinate their response to Dorothy's unexpected independence. "Mom," Jennifer said, her voice shifting to the controlled tone she used when explaining obvious truths to people who were being deliberately obtuse. "I think you need to reconsider these changes. Family financial cooperation benefits everyone, and creating artificial barriers between family members isn't healthy for family relationships." The phrase artificial barriers was Jennifer's characterization of Dorothy's decision to control her own financial resources. In Jennifer's mind, Dorothy's assertion of basic financial boundaries was an attack on family unity rather than a reasonable response to being exploited. "You're absolutely right," Dorothy agreed. "Family financial cooperation should benefit everyone. When you're ready to contribute to that cooperation instead of simply benefiting from it, we can discuss restoring your access to family financial resources." The conversation ended with Jennifer's abrupt disconnection, leaving Dorothy and Michael sitting in her kitchen amid the ruins of financial arrangements that had supported their comfortable assumptions about family obligation and maternal duty. Michael looked around Dorothy's kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, his expression suggesting that he was finally beginning to understand that the quiet, accommodating mother who'd funded his lifestyle for 3 years had been replaced by someone who understood the difference between supporting family and enabling exploitation. "So what happens now?" Michael asked quietly. Dorothy smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd finally found her backbone after years of bending to accommodate other people's demands. "Now," she said, "you both learn what independence actually costs." Friday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that made Dorothy grateful for the warmth of her small colonial home, though she suspected the evening ahead would test her resolve more than the weather would test her heating bill. At 6:47 p.m., 3 cars pulled into her driveway with the coordinated precision of a military operation: Jennifer's BMW, Michael's struggling pickup truck, and Kevin's sedan, a vehicle Dorothy hadn't expected, but which suggested that Jennifer had escalated this family crisis to include reinforcements. Dorothy watched through her living room window as her family emerged from their vehicles and gathered on her front lawn for what appeared to be a strategic planning session. Kevin's presence was particularly telling. Jennifer's husband rarely involved himself in family dynamics unless Jennifer had convinced him that his business expertise was needed to resolve a situation that required professional-level negotiation skills. The doorbell rang with authority, rather than the casual family intrusion Dorothy had grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. When she opened the door, she was confronted with 3 adults whose expressions had been carefully arranged to project united concern rather than individual desperation. "Mom," Jennifer said with the warm smile she used when approaching delicate negotiations, "we were hoping we could all sit down and have a family conversation about some concerning changes that seem to be affecting everyone." The phrase "concerning changes" was Jennifer's diplomatic characterization of Dorothy's decision to stop funding their lifestyles. The suggestion that these changes were affecting everyone implied that Dorothy's financial boundaries were causing family-wide problems, rather than simply requiring her children to take responsibility for their own expenses. "Of course," Dorothy replied, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Please come in." Kevin entered last, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested he'd come prepared with documentation for whatever intervention they'd planned. Dorothy had always found Kevin to be pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of middle management personality who'd found in Jennifer a wife whose social ambitions aligned with his corporate aspirations. His presence tonight suggested that Jennifer had convinced him that Dorothy's financial independence posed a threat to their household budget that required immediate resolution. They settled in Dorothy's living room, with Jennifer and Kevin claiming the sofa while Michael took Robert's old recliner, a choice that Dorothy found symbolically irritating. The seating arrangement felt deliberately formal, as if her children had transformed her living room into a conference room where they would present their case for restoring access to her financial resources. "Before we begin," Kevin said, opening his portfolio with business meeting efficiency, "I want to say that Jennifer and I really appreciate everything you've done to support the family over the past few years. Your generosity has been incredible, and we don't want you to think that anyone takes that support for granted." The opening statement was clearly rehearsed, designed to acknowledge Dorothy's contributions while establishing a foundation for whatever request was coming next. Kevin's corporate training was evident in his approach: begin with appreciation, identify shared goals, then present solutions that benefit everyone involved. However, Kevin continued, consulting notes from his portfolio, some of the recent changes to family financial arrangements have created unexpected challenges that we think could be resolved through better communication and coordination. Dorothy noted Kevin's careful language. Her decision to control her own credit cards and phone service had become changes to family financial arrangements. Her assertion of basic financial boundaries had been reframed as a coordination problem that better communication could solve. "What kind of challenges?" Dorothy asked, genuinely curious about how they would characterize the consequences of losing access to resources they'd never earned. Michael shifted uncomfortably in Robert's chair before answering. "Well, the phone situation has been really difficult for my business. I've lost contact with 3 potential clients because my numbers suddenly stopped working. And it's going to take time to re-establish service and notify everyone about the number change." Jennifer nodded supportively. "And the credit card changes came at a really inconvenient time. I was in the middle of purchasing the twins' winter clothes, and having my transaction declined at the store was embarrassing and disruptive." Dorothy listened to their catalog of inconveniences with growing amazement. Michael was complaining about business disruption caused by his inability to pay for his own phone service. Jennifer was characterizing her embarrassment over a declined transaction as a family problem requiring group resolution. Neither of them seemed to recognize that their problems stemmed from their assumption that someone else would indefinitely fund their basic expenses. "These sound like problems that could be solved by paying for your own services," Dorothy observed. Kevin consulted his notes again, apparently moving to the next phase of their planned presentation. That's actually what we wanted to discuss. Jennifer and I have been reviewing our household budget, and we've identified some strategies that could help everyone manage expenses more efficiently, while maintaining the family cooperation that's worked so well for the past few years. The phrase family cooperation was Kevin's euphemism for Dorothy's financial subsidies. His suggestion that this arrangement had worked so well ignored the fact that it had only worked well for people who weren't paying the bills. "I'm interested to hear your strategies," Dorothy said, settling back in her chair with the anticipation of someone about to witness an impressive performance. Jennifer leaned forward with the earnest expression she used when proposing solutions that benefited her while appearing to consider everyone's needs. "We've been thinking that instead of individual family members having separate accounts and services, we could create a more integrated family financial structure that would give everyone better control and transparency." Michael nodded enthusiastically. "Like a family business approach, where everyone contributes according to their ability and everyone benefits according to their needs." Dorothy almost smiled at Michael's casual appropriation of Marxist economic theory to justify continued access to her resources. The idea that their family should operate according to communist principles, from each according to ability to each according to need, was particularly rich coming from two people whose abilities had never extended to paying their own bills. "That's an interesting concept," Dorothy said. "How would you determine each person's ability to contribute?" Kevin opened his portfolio to reveal printed spreadsheets that he'd apparently prepared for this presentation. "We've done some preliminary analysis of family income and expenses, and we think we can create a system that's fair for everyone." Dorothy accepted the spreadsheet Kevin offered, scanning the columns with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 43 years reviewing medical charts and financial records. What she saw was breathtaking in its presumption and stunning in its mathematical creativity. According to Kevin's analysis, Dorothy's quote, 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 e, quote, 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 quote. The spreadsheet included estimates for investment returns, property value appreciation, and something called legacy wealth management that appeared to be Kevin's speculation about financial resources that Dorothy might have access to but hadn't disclosed. Meanwhile, Michael's contribution capacity was calculated based on his business's potential revenue rather than its actual performance, while Jennifer and Kevin's contribution was calculated after deducting, quote, child-related expenses and professional development costs that apparently reduced their available funds to nearly zero. The result was a, quote, fair distribution formula that would require Dorothy to contribute approximately $2,800 per month to the family financial pool, while Michael would contribute $300 and Jennifer's family would contribute $150. In exchange, all family members would have access to shared resources for phones, credit cards, insurance, and emergency funds. "This is remarkable," Dorothy said, genuinely impressed by the sophisticated rationalization that Kevin had created to justify her continued subsidization of their expenses. "You've managed to create a mathematical formula that requires me to pay for everyone else's lifestyle while calling it fair distribution." Kevin's expression shifted slightly as he realized that Dorothy wasn't impressed by his analytical approach. "Well, the formula accounts for different family members' capacity to contribute and different family members' needs for support. It accounts for your desire to continue accessing my resources while contributing virtually nothing in return," Dorothy corrected. "You've created a budget that requires me to pay $2,800 per month, so that you can pay $150 and call it family cooperation." Jennifer intervened with the patient tone she used when explaining obvious truths to people who were missing important details. "Mom, the formula is based on actual financial capacity. Your pension and Social Security provide stable income, while Michael's business and Kevin's career have more variable cash flow. The family pool approach smooths out those variations so everyone has security." The explanation was seductive in the way that all of Jennifer's manipulations were seductive. It reframed exploitation as family security and presented Dorothy's financial independence as selfishness that threatened everyone's well-being. "Let me make sure I understand," Dorothy said, reviewing Kevin's spreadsheet again. "You want to create a family financial pool where I contribute $2,800 per month, and in exchange, I get access to shared family resources that I'm funding almost entirely myself." Michael leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd finally found a solution to his chronic financial problems. "But you'd also have the security of knowing that if you ever had an emergency, the whole family would be there to support you." Dorothy looked around her living room at 3 adults who were offering to support her financially using money that she would be providing to them. The circular logic was dizzying in its audacity. "What happens if I decline to participate in this family financial pool?" Dorothy asked. The question created a moment of uncomfortable silence, as her children processed the possibility that their carefully crafted solution might not be voluntary. "Well," Jennifer said carefully, "we hope you wouldn't decline because family cooperation benefits everyone. But if you did choose not to participate, it would obviously affect family relationships and family activities." Kevin nodded supportively. "We're not trying to pressure anyone, but practical realities mean that family financial decisions affect how much families can do together." Dorothy recognized the subtle threat embedded in their reasonable explanations. If she didn't contribute to their family financial pool, she would be excluded from family activities and relationships. They were offering to continue including her in the family she'd raised and supported, but only if she paid them $2,800 per month for the privilege. "I have a counter-proposal," Dorothy said, setting Kevin's spreadsheet aside. "Instead of a family financial pool, why don't you each pay for your own expenses using your own resources, and we'll maintain family relationships based on love and respect rather than financial contribution." The suggestion landed in her living room like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of confusion and discomfort that spread across all 3 faces. "That's not really practical," Michael said after a moment. "My business is still developing, and I need family support during the growth phase. And Kevin and I have significant expenses related to the twins' education and activities," Jennifer added. "Single-family financial management doesn't account for different family members' different needs and obligations." Dorothy studied her children's faces, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since Robert's death. They weren't offering family cooperation. They were demanding continued subsidization while calling it something more palatable. They weren't proposing shared financial responsibility. They were creating elaborate justifications for why she should continue paying their bills while they contributed virtually nothing. "I think I understand your proposal perfectly," Dorothy said finally. "You want me to continue funding your lifestyles, but you'd like to formalize the arrangement so that my financial support feels more like family cooperation and less like charity." Kevin's portfolio snapped shut with the sharp sound of a negotiation that had taken an unexpected turn. "Mrs. Hansen, I think you're mischaracterizing our intentions. We're trying to find solutions that work for everyone." "You're trying to find solutions that work for you," Dorothy corrected. "Solutions that restore your access to my resources while requiring minimal contribution from your own resources." The evening was about to take a turn that would surprise everyone in the room, including Dorothy herself. For 3 years, she'd been accommodating their demands because she'd believed that family love required endless sacrifice. Tonight, she was about to discover that family love could also require tough consequences, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was refuse to enable their children's irresponsibility. The education was about to continue, and this lesson would be more expensive than anything they'd learned so far. Dorothy excused herself to the kitchen under the pretense of making coffee, leaving her children and Kevin to whisper urgently among themselves in her living room. She could hear fragments of their conversation through the thin walls. Jennifer's sharp insistence that they needed to stay united, Michael's worried mumbling about his business obligations, and Kevin's measured responses about alternative approaches if their initial strategy failed. But Dorothy wasn't preparing coffee. Instead, she was retrieving a manila folder from the kitchen drawer, where she'd placed it that morning after her final conversation with James Morrison, her financial planner. The folder contained documents that would transform this evening from a family negotiation into a lesson about consequences that her children would never forget. When she returned to the living room carrying a coffee tray and the manila folder, the whispered conversation stopped abruptly. Jennifer immediately shifted into hostess mode, accepting a cup with gracious appreciation while Kevin consulted his portfolio again, apparently preparing for the next phase of their presentation. "Before we continue discussing your family financial pool," Dorothy said, settling into her chair with the manila folder in her lap, "I think there are some things you should know about my actual financial situation." Michael's attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of things?" Dorothy opened the folder and withdrew several documents that she arranged on the coffee table, with the methodical precision she'd learned during 43 years of organizing medical charts. Bank statements, investment summaries, and insurance documents formed a neat display that represented 3 years of financial decisions her children had never bothered to understand. "These are my complete financial records for the past 3 years," Dorothy announced. "Every loan I've provided, every gift I've given, every expense I've covered, and every account I've maintained." Jennifer leaned forward with the eager expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this kind of financial transparency. "That's wonderful, Mom. Financial openness is exactly what healthy families need." "I agree," Dorothy replied. "So let's start with Michael's loans." She withdrew a detailed spreadsheet that she'd prepared, using the same meticulous record-keeping skills that had made her one of Richmond General's most reliable charge nurses. Michael's financial history was documented with clinical precision: dates, amounts, stated purposes, and repayment status. "Over the past 3 years," Dorothy announced, "Michael has borrowed $47,000 from me." The loans were described as temporary business assistance for equipment purchases, vehicle repairs, and emergency expenses. Michael's face went pale as Dorothy continued reading from her records. June 2021, $3,200 for truck transmission repair. Promised repayment within 90 days. Current status, unpaid. September 2021, $5,500 for landscape equipment lease. Promised repayment within 6 months. Current status, unpaid. January 2022, $2,800 for insurance deductible after work-related accident. Promised repayment when settlement was received. Current status, unpaid. The list continued for several minutes, each entry documenting Michael's enthusiastic promises and consistent failure to honor any financial commitments. By the time Dorothy finished reading, the room was silent, except for the sound of Kevin frantically scribbling notes in his portfolio. "Michael," Dorothy said gently, "according to my records, you've repaid exactly $0 of the $47,000 you've borrowed. Would you like to dispute any of these entries?" Michael opened and closed his mouth several times before finding his voice. "Mom, you know my business has been unpredictable. I always intended to pay you back when things stabilized." "When things stabilized," Dorothy repeated. "How long do you think it should take for things to stabilize in a business that's been operating for 7 years?" The question hung in the air like an accusation that Michael couldn't deflect with promises about future success or explanations about temporary setbacks. Dorothy turned to Jennifer with the same clinical attention. Jennifer's situation is somewhat different, because most of her financial assistance was characterized as gifts rather than loans. She withdrew another spreadsheet, this one documenting 3 years of gifts that had funded Jennifer's lifestyle aspirations. Christmas gifts for the twins. $4,200 total over 3 years, which represents approximately 4 times what grandparents typically spend. Contribution to family vacation expenses. $8,500 for trips that I didn't attend. Educational expenses. $12,300 for private lesson programs and enrichment activities. Jennifer's expression shifted from eager anticipation to defensive concern, as Dorothy's documentation revealed the scope of financial support that Jennifer had been treating as normal family assistance. "The total amount of gifts I've provided to Jennifer's family over 3 years is $31,000, Dorothy announced. "This doesn't include indirect support like insurance coverage, family plan discounts, or credit card convenience that Kevin mentioned in his presentation tonight." Kevin stopped taking notes, apparently realizing that his carefully crafted family financial pool proposal was being undermined by Dorothy's revelation of the actual financial dynamics that had been operating for years. "Combined," Dorothy continued, "I've provided $78,000 in direct financial support to my children over the past 3 years. This represents approximately 60% of my total pension and Social Security income during that period." The number landed in her living room like a bomb, creating a crater of silence that none of her children seemed able to fill. Dorothy had been impoverishing herself to fund their lifestyle choices, while they'd been planning to formalize her exploitation through Kevin's family financial pool. Now, Dorothy said, consulting the final document in her folder, let me share some information that might affect your family financial planning going forward. She withdrew a letter from Morrison, Hayes & Associates, the financial planning firm that had been managing Robert's legacy accounts. The letter's official letterhead and formal language immediately commanded attention from everyone in the room. Yesterday, I met with my financial planner to review some accounts that your father established before his death. Accounts that I wasn't supposed to access until I reached age 72 or faced significant medical expenses. Jennifer's business instincts immediately focused on the potential windfall. What kind of accounts? How much money are we talking about? Dorothy noted Jennifer's immediate use of we when discussing financial resources that belonged exclusively to Dorothy. Her daughter's assumption that any family money automatically included her was breathtaking in its presumption. The accounts totaled $247,000, Dorothy announced. Retirement investments, life insurance policies, and medical care trusts that your father established to ensure my financial independence. Kevin's calculator appeared as if by magic, and Dorothy could see him mentally recalculating his family financial pool proposal to account for Dorothy's substantially greater resources than he'd estimated. That's wonderful, Jennifer said with genuine excitement. Mom, this changes everything. With that kind of financial security, you could easily afford to participate in our family financial cooperation plan. Kevin's $2,800 monthly contribution estimate was actually quite conservative. Dorothy looked around her living room at three adults whose immediate response to learning about her financial resources was to increase their demands for access to those resources. Not one of them had expressed happiness that she wouldn't need to worry about medical expenses or retirement security. Their first instinct was to calculate how her good fortune could benefit their financial situations. Actually, Dorothy said, returning the financial planning letter to her folder, this information doesn't change anything about my participation in your family financial pool. Michael leaned forward with confusion rather than concern. What do you mean it doesn't change anything? With that kind of money available, family cooperation should be easier, not harder. Dorothy stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where Robert's photo had watched over decades of family conversations. She touched the frame gently before turning back to face her children with the calm authority of someone who'd finally found her backbone. It doesn't change anything because I've decided to cancel all of your credit cards permanently. The announcement was delivered with such quiet finality that it took several seconds for her children to process what they'd heard. Cancel our credit cards? Jennifer's voice rose with a pitch that indicated genuine panic. Mom, you can't be serious. We have payments scheduled, automatic bills, ongoing expenses that depend on those accounts. You don't have credit cards, Dorothy corrected. You had access to my credit cards, which I've chosen to revoke permanently. Kevin consulted his portfolio frantically, apparently looking for precedents or procedures that might apply to this unexpected development. Mrs. Hansen, surely we can work out some kind of transition period. Sudden financial changes can have serious consequences for people's credit ratings and payment obligations. Dorothy almost smiled at Kevin's concern for financial consequences. For 3 years, she'd been absorbing the financial consequences of her children's poor planning and irresponsible spending. Now they were discovering what consequences felt like when they weren't cushioned by someone else's resources. There's more, Dorothy announced, returning to her chair and withdrawing the final document from her manila folder. I've also terminated your phone service, removed you from my insurance policies, and established new banking relationships that don't include any family members as authorized users or beneficiaries. The systematic dismantling of their access to her resources was delivered with the methodical precision of someone executing a carefully planned strategy. Dorothy had spent the week not just cutting off their current access, but ensuring that they couldn't manipulate their way back into access through family pressure or emotional appeals. Michael stood up abruptly, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something approaching desperation. You can't do this. We're family. We depend on each other. You can't just cut us off without warning. I can and I have, Dorothy replied. And I gave you plenty of warning. Every time you treated my medical appointments as optional, every time you dismissed my concerns as unimportant, every time you assumed my resources were family property available for your use, that was warning. Jennifer was calculating furiously, apparently trying to determine the scope of financial disruption that Dorothy's actions would create for her household budget. Mom, this is going to cause serious problems. Kevin and I have obligations that were based on the assumption of continued family financial cooperation. You have obligations that were based on the assumption that I would indefinitely subsidize your lifestyle choices, Dorothy corrected. That assumption was incorrect. Kevin closed his portfolio with the defeated air of someone whose negotiation strategy had not just failed, but been completely obliterated. Mrs. Hansen, I hope you'll reconsider these decisions. Family financial relationships can be rebuilt, but they require trust and cooperation from all parties. Dorothy looked at Kevin with the clinical assessment she'd once used to evaluate medical students who'd failed to understand basic principles of patient care. You're absolutely right about requiring trust and cooperation from all parties. That's exactly why these changes are permanent. The evening was about to reach its conclusion, but not before Dorothy delivered one final lesson about respect, family relationships, and the true cost of taking someone's generosity for granted. Her children were about to discover that the quiet nurse who'd spent 3 years accommodating their demands had been replaced by an independent woman who understood that love sometimes required consequences, and that family relationships built on financial exploitation weren't worth preserving. The most expensive education of their lives was about to conclude with a lesson they would never forget. The silence that followed Dorothy's announcement stretched for nearly a full minute, long enough for the grandfather clock in her hallway to chime 9 times, marking the end of an evening that would forever divide her family's history into before and after. Jennifer sat frozen on the sofa, her coffee cup suspended halfway to her lips as if the motion of drinking had been interrupted by a seismic shift she couldn't quite process. Kevin's portfolio lay closed in his lap, his careful financial projections rendered meaningless by Dorothy's systematic demolition of every assumption they'd built their lifestyle around. Michael remained standing beside Robert's recliner, swaying slightly as if the weight of $47,000 in unpaid debts had finally become a physical burden he could feel. It was Jennifer who broke the silence, her voice carrying a tremor that Dorothy had never heard before. Mom, I think you need to slow down and think about what you're doing. These kinds of dramatic financial changes, they're not reversible. Once you damage family relationships, it's very difficult to repair them. The threat was delivered with Jennifer's characteristic blend of concern and manipulation, but Dorothy detected something new in her daughter's tone, a genuine uncertainty about whether emotional manipulation would still work on a mother who just demonstrated the capacity for decisive action. You're absolutely right, Dorothy agreed, surprising everyone in the room. These changes aren't reversible, that's exactly why I've made them. Michael finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak that suggested his throat had gone dry. But what about my business? Mom, I've got contracts pending, equipment payments due, employees depending on me. I can't. You can't what? Dorothy asked with genuine curiosity. You can't run a business without someone else paying your bills? You can't meet your obligations using your own resources? You can't take responsibility for decisions you made as an adult? The questions landed like surgical strikes, each one exposing a different aspect of Michael's fundamental dependency on resources he'd never earned. For 7 years, Michael had been running a business that was profitable only when someone else absorbed its costs and risks. Dorothy's questions forced him to confront the reality that his business was essentially an expensive hobby subsidized by his mother's financial sacrifice. Kevin opened his portfolio one more time, apparently unable to abandon his analytical approach, even in the face of complete strategic failure. Mrs. Hansen, I understand you're feeling unappreciated, and frankly, that's on us. We should have done a better job of acknowledging your contributions. But surely there's a middle ground between the current arrangement and complete financial separation. Dorothy studied Kevin's face with the clinical assessment she'd once used to evaluate family members who couldn't accept a terminal diagnosis. Kevin, what would that middle ground look like? Would I fund 50% of your lifestyle instead of 90%? Would I pay for every other month of your phone service? Would I cover half of Jennifer's shopping expenses? Kevin's silence revealed that he hadn't actually considered what a middle ground might entail. He'd simply been negotiating for continued access to Dorothy's resources in whatever form she might be willing to provide. The middle ground you're looking for is called independence, Dorothy continued. You pay for your own expenses using your own income, and we maintain family relationships based on love and respect rather than financial dependence. Jennifer stood up abruptly, pacing to the window with the restless energy of someone whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around her. This is insane. You're talking about destroying everything we've built as a family. The cooperation, the support, the shared goals, all of it gone because you've decided to be selfish about money. The accusation of selfishness was perfectly delivered, designed to make Dorothy feel guilty for prioritizing her own financial security over her children's comfort. For 3 years, this kind of emotional manipulation had been devastatingly effective, triggering Dorothy's maternal instincts to sacrifice her well-being for her children's happiness. But sitting in her living room, surrounded by the documentary evidence of her exploitation, Dorothy felt no guilt, only the crystalline clarity that comes from finally understanding the difference between supporting family and enabling adults who refuse to grow up. Jennifer, Dorothy said with the patience of someone explaining obvious truths to a child, I've been funding your lifestyle for 3 years while neglecting my own medical care, depleting my own savings, and subsidizing your inability to live within your means. If choosing my own financial security over your comfort is selfish, then I'm proud to be selfish. The evening took its final turn when Michael's phone, Dorothy's old flip phone that she'd loaned him Thursday morning, began ringing with the aggressive persistence that suggested an emergency. Michael answered with the defeated tone of someone who'd run out of good news. Henderson Landscaping, he said, apparently still trying to maintain professional appearances despite his collapsing personal circumstances. Dorothy could hear the voice on the other end, though she couldn't make out specific words. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with Michael responding mostly in monosyllables that grew increasingly dejected. When he hung up, his face had gone completely pale. That was Mrs. Henderson, Michael announced to the room. She's canceling the contract. Apparently, one of their neighbors told them about my financial difficulties, and they've decided to go with a more established company. The timing was perfect, delivering an immediate consequence that illustrated exactly what Dorothy had been trying to explain about the relationship between financial irresponsibility and business failure. Michael's inability to manage his personal finances had now cost him the professional opportunity he'd been willing to sacrifice Dorothy's medical appointment to pursue. How did the neighbors know about your financial difficulties? Dorothy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Michael's shoulders sagged as he realized the scope of his reputation problems. Small towns talk. When your phone gets disconnected and your credit cards get declined, people notice. Word gets around that you're having money problems. Jennifer whirled around from the window, her face flushed with anger that had been building throughout the evening. See? This is exactly what I was talking about. Your financial games are affecting all of us. Michael's losing business, Kevin and I are going to have credit problems, and the twins are going to be embarrassed when they can't participate in activities that require family financial stability. The phrase financial games was Jennifer's characterization of Dorothy's decision to control her own resources. In Jennifer's mind, Dorothy's assertion of financial independence was frivolous entertainment that unfairly affected serious people with real obligations. My financial games? Dorothy repeated with dangerous calm. Jennifer, you've been playing financial games for 3 years. You've been living a lifestyle you can't afford using money you didn't earn while convincing yourself that my subsidies were family cooperation rather than charity. Kevin stood up and began gathering his portfolio materials with the efficient movements of someone executing a strategic retreat. I think we should give everyone some time to cool down and reconsider these decisions when emotions aren't running so high. My emotions aren't running high, Dorothy replied. My emotions are perfectly clear. For the first time in 3 years, I'm making financial decisions based on rational planning rather than emotional manipulation. As her family prepared to leave, Dorothy felt compelled to deliver one final piece of information that would help them understand the scope of what they'd lost through their selfishness and disrespect. Before you go, she said, rising to retrieve one last document from her manila folder, there's something else you should know about your father's financial planning. The room went still again as Dorothy withdrew a letter that bore the letterhead of a different law firm, one that specialized in estate planning and charitable giving. Robert didn't just establish accounts for my medical care and financial independence, Dorothy announced. He also established a charitable foundation that was supposed to provide educational scholarships for local children whose families couldn't afford college expenses. Jennifer's business instincts immediately focused on the implications. How much money are we talking about? The foundation was capitalized with $180,000, Dorothy said. Money that was supposed to be distributed over 10 years to help deserving students attend college. Kevin's calculator reappeared as he apparently couldn't resist quantifying every financial revelation. Was supposed to be distributed? What happened to the money? Dorothy's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I used it to cover the $78,000 in family loans and gifts that I documented tonight. Your selfishness didn't just cost you access to my resources. It cost 18 local teenagers their college scholarships. The revelation hit her children like a physical blow. Michael staggered backward into Robert's chair. Jennifer's hand flew to her throat, and Kevin's portfolio scattered across the floor as he processed the magnitude of what their financial exploitation had actually cost. You see, Dorothy continued with clinical precision, when I started depleting my own savings to cover your lifestyle expenses, I had to redirect money from the scholarship fund to maintain my basic living expenses. Every loan I gave Michael, every gift I provided Jennifer, every family emergency I resolved, that money came from college scholarships that were supposed to help kids who actually deserved financial assistance. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences of the evening. This wasn't shock or confusion. This was the crushing weight of understanding that their selfishness had harmed people beyond their own family, that their casual exploitation of Dorothy's generosity had stolen opportunities from teenagers who would never even know why their scholarship applications had been denied. Michael was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, we didn't know. If we'd known about the scholarship fund, we never would have. Would have what? Dorothy interrupted. Would have asked for less money? Would have actually repaid your loans? Would have treated me with more respect? Michael had no answer, because they all knew the truth. Knowing about the scholarship fund wouldn't have changed their behavior. It simply would have required them to create more elaborate justifications for their continued exploitation of Dorothy's resources. As her family finally prepared to leave, Dorothy felt the profound peace that comes from aligning actions with values. For 3 years, she'd been enabling her children's worst impulses while depleting resources that could have served worthy purposes. Now she was free to honor Robert's memory by rebuilding the scholarship fund, supporting her own health and independence, and demonstrating that respect and gratitude couldn't be taken for granted. 6 months later, Dorothy stood in the auditorium of Richmond Community College, watching as 12 local students received the first scholarships from the restored Robert Hansen Memorial Education Foundation. Her quarterly cancer screenings had shown continued improvement, her financial independence was secure, and her relationship with her children was slowly rebuilding on foundations of mutual respect rather than financial dependence. Michael had eventually established his own phone service and was learning to run his business within his actual means, rather than his imagined potential. Jennifer and Kevin had downsized their lifestyle and were discovering that happiness didn't require constant financial stress funded by someone else's sacrifice. Most importantly, Dorothy had learned that sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was refuse to enable their children's irresponsibility, even when that refusal required the courage to say no to people she loved more than life itself. The foundation was thriving, the family was healing, and Dorothy Hansen had finally learned that respect couldn't be demanded, gratitude couldn't be assumed, and some bridges were worth burning to illuminate what truly mattered. Her children had wanted easy access to unearned wealth. Instead, they'd received the harder gift of learning to build lives based on their own efforts and values. It was the most expensive education any of them had ever received, and for the first time in years, Dorothy was confident it had been worth every penny. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.